Hello, lovely folks of YouTube, Ren here. So this is the time of year that a lot of you have this very magical ingredient in your homes that you usually overlook or throw away. Eggshells. Whether you celebrate Ostara or Easter, either one, you're probably making a lot of eggs, and we can use those. We can use those. So what I have right here is eggshell powder. It's literally just eggshells that are ground into powder. And it can be used both in your garden and in your magical practice. So we're going to talk about that. So our eggshells here, obviously this is an egg that I probably used in baking. I've had them sitting for a little while drying out. So the inside of the egg was used. And then the eggshell itself was dried. Now, before you actually dry your eggshell, one of the things that I don't have that I can't show you, but there's a little like inner membrane that lines the inside of the eggshell. It's best if you remove that because it's much easier to grind your eggshells if you do that. If you do that when the eggshell is wet and fresh, like right after you've just cracked it, that's the easiest time. You find that if you just kind of rub your finger on the inside, it'll kind of peel away into sections and you can just peel it off. I find that inner membrane tends to have just like a slightly like almost sort of bluish purple tinge to it that makes it easier to see where it is and where it isn't. So remove the contents of your egg, peel off the inner membrane, and then allow the eggshells to fully dry. I give them several days to do this at room temperature. You can also speed it up by putting them in the oven at a low temperature. I would recommend using the oven method if you plan on ingesting your eggshell, because that way you're also killing off any bacteria that may be on the eggshell. But if you're just going to use it out in the garden or for other purposes aside from eating it, then it is fine to just let it dry at room temperature. So once you have your eggshells, obviously fully dried, literally just crush them up by hand into large pieces. And then go after them with your mortar and pestle. Now, the thing with eggshells is that once they're fully ground down, they do not have a whole lot of volume to them. Like that one big egg will make maybe between a quarter teaspoon and a half teaspoon of eggshell powder, depending on how finely I grind it. So, you're going to need a lot of eggs. That's why I always recommend anytime you're making anything with eggs, save your eggshells because that way you can use them. This whole big jar that I have here, this is probably like 30 or 40 eggs worth of eggshell powder. So as you can see, it doesn't go very far. So save all your eggs. In the garden, this can be used as a good soil amender. There are a lot of plants, in particular tomatoes are the ones that are most notorious for this, that need a little bit more calcium in the soil. Calcium is good for fruit production, so anytime you have something that's going to be making fruit, tomatoes, peppers, anything like that, they tend to need a little bit more calcium. So you can put this eggshell powder into the planting hole as you plant your plant. Or you can just spread it on the soil, on top of the soil around the plant as just a little, what we call top dressing. Either way, that calcium will eventually leach into the soil. It does not have to be super fine if you're going to use it for a garden amender, but just keep in mind that the more finely it's ground, the more quickly it's going to break down and get into the soil. So, now, let's talk about some of the magical uses of this. Some of you may be more familiar with the term Cascarilla in reference to eggshell powder. Cascarilla is the term that's used in a lot of the African traditional religions, like Santeria, Voodoo, etc. That is originally a name that was used for the powdered inner bark of the Croton eleuteria, which is a tree that's actually native to the Caribbean. As the people who were members of the ATRs moved further north, they no longer had that ingredient available to them. So the natural replacement for it was eggshell powder, because the eggshell powder is similar in function. But eggshells are universal. They're not, we're not calling it Cascarilla because I'm not a member of one of the ATRs. I'm not using it exactly the same way, but we can just look at the actual energy and purposes of the eggshell itself and utilize that in our magical practice. So when you're looking at eggshells, you think about, like, what does an eggshell do? It's a protective barrier. It forms a barrier around the developing embryo of the bird, chicken in this case, to protect it from anything that would harm it. But that barrier is permeable. It lets in the good things that the embryo needs, namely oxygen. So we can utilize it to that purpose in our magical practices. Just utilizing the eggshell powder is symbolic for forming a protective barrier that keeps out the bad things but lets in the good things. So obviously this is a great option for making a magic circle, especially if you're going to be outside. You don't want to use salt if you can avoid it. Certainly don't want to actually like put salt down in a circle outside, because salt can kill the plants, unless you're using Epsom salt. That's a different thing. But eggshell powder makes a great option for building a magic circle, like actually scribing a magic circle outside. It's also a good option for like just sprinkling it in a line around your home in order to form a protective barrier around your home. The really super fine, like really fine powdered eggshell can actually be you mix it with just a little bit of flour and water, and you can pack it into what's basically like a stick of chalk, and you can use that for forming protective sigils. That's usually what you see the Cascarilla sold as here in the Botanicas here in the Americas, is they sort of pack the eggshell powder into little ketchup cups, and then you use it like a stick of chalk. But yeah, that's always an option, of course. So it's a really good, really essentially free ingredient that can be used both in your magic and in your garden. So yeah, don't throw away your eggshells. They're really good. Obviously, if you have dyed eggshells, you can still use them in the garden. And depending on the color that you've dyed the eggshells, you might still be able to use them in magical practice. Just you can be creative with it. So anyway, there you go. So I'm going to keep grinding this, but I don't need you to watch me do that. Save your eggshells. They're really useful. Hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.